The silence in the Chicago boardroom was deafening. Marcus Wellington's words hung in the air like poison. I don't shake hands with staff. His manicured hand recoiled as if burned, leaving Victoria Harris standing there with her arm outstretched. 27 floors above the bustling streets of downtown Chicago, in a room where billion-dollar decisions were made daily, time seemed frozen. The distinguished CEO of Wellington Industries had just made the biggest mistake of his career. Because Victoria wasn't staff. She was about to announce the largest renewable energy deal in corporate history. $4 billion that would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you.
The morning of September 15th started like any other at the Renaissance Tower in Chicago's financial district. The 37th floor buzzed with the controlled energy of power brokers, venture capitalists, and industry titans gathering for the Midwest Energy Innovation Summit. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Lake Michigan sparkled in the early autumn sunlight, while inside, the conference room filled with the scent of fresh coffee and the rustle of expensive suits. Victoria Harris stepped off the elevator at exactly 8:45. Her burgundy blazer impeccably tailored, her natural hair styled in an elegant updo that spoke of both professionalism and quiet confidence. At 34, she carried herself with the poise of someone who had earned every step of her journey. Her dark eyes swept across the gathering crowd, mentally cataloging faces she recognized from Forbes covers and Wall Street Journal headlines. The conference room itself was a testament to corporate excess. Italian marble floors reflected the light from crystal chandeliers, while mahogany panels lined the walls between massive windows offering panoramic views of the city. Round tables draped in crisp white linens were arranged theater-style, each set with gleaming water glasses and leather portfolios embossed with the summit's logo. Marcus Wellington entered the room like a storm front rolling across the plains. At 58, he commanded attention without trying. Silver hair perfectly coiffed, a navy suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, and a Patek Philippe watch that caught the light as he gestured dismissively at his assistant. Wellington Industries had dominated the traditional energy sector for 3 decades, and Marcus wore that power like armor. He moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of a man who had never been told no, pausing to shake hands with familiar faces, his laugh booming across conversations. Senator Patricia Caldwell from Illinois smiled warmly as he approached her table. The mayor of Chicago, David Chen, raised his coffee cup in greeting. These were his people, his world, his domain. Victoria watched from across the room, noting how the crowd seemed to part naturally for Wellington, how conversations paused when he approached, and how even seasoned executives straightened their posture slightly in his presence. She had studied him for months, knew his company's financial statements better than his own CFO probably did, understood his weaknesses and blind spots with the precision of a chess master planning 20 moves ahead. The irony wasn't lost on her. While Wellington Industries had spent billions propping up dying coal plants and fighting renewable energy legislation, Victoria had been quietly building the infrastructure that would make his empire obsolete. Solar farms across Arizona and Nevada, wind installations throughout Texas and Kansas, battery storage facilities that could power entire cities during peak demand. Her company, Phoenix Energy Solutions, had been operating in stealth mode for 3 years, avoiding the spotlight while accumulating the technology and partnerships that would reshape the entire industry. She moved through the crowd with deliberate purpose, introducing herself to investors she hadn't met, reinforcing relationships with those she had. Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine, her business cards simple white cardstock with elegant black lettering. No flashy logos or corporate buzzwords, just her name, title, and contact information. The confidence of someone who didn't need to oversell herself. Dr. Sarah Chan from Stanford approached her near the coffee station, her face lighting up with recognition. "Victoria, I didn't expect to see you here. Are you finally ready to come out of hiding?" They spoke in low tones about grid integration challenges and breakthrough battery chemistry. Their conversation, the kind of technical depth that separated real innovators from financial engineers looking for quick returns. Across the room, Wellington was holding court at his preferred corner table, surrounded by his usual circle of traditional energy executives and friendly politicians. Oil executives from Houston, natural gas pipeline owners from Oklahoma, coal plant operators from West Virginia. They spoke in the casual shorthand of men who had controlled American energy policy for generations. Their conversation peppered with references to regulatory capture and campaign contributions. The morning's first presentation was delivered by Thomas Anderson from Goldman Sachs, outlining global energy investment trends. Victoria listened carefully, taking notes not on the obvious talking points, but on the subtle admissions buried in his data. Traditional energy investments were down 37% year over year. Insurance companies were quietly divesting from fossil fuel projects. Even sovereign wealth funds were shifting billions toward renewable infrastructure. During the coffee break, she found herself in a conversation with Jennifer Walsh, the Energy Secretary for the state of Illinois. Their discussions centered on grid modernization and the technical challenges of integrating large-scale renewable projects with existing infrastructure. Walsh was impressed by Victoria's depth of knowledge, particularly her understanding of regulatory frameworks that most private sector executives ignored. Wellington, meanwhile, was growing increasingly agitated by the morning's presentations. The renewable energy talk was all theoretical nonsense as far as he was concerned. Pretty PowerPoint slides that ignored the fundamental realities of baseload power and grid stability. His company had weathered environmental protests, survived regulatory changes, and adapted to market shifts. This green energy fad would pass like all the others. As the morning progressed, Victoria became increasingly aware that she was being watched. Not just casual observation, but the focused attention of someone trying to place her in their mental filing system. A few investors approached her directly, curious about her company's work, but she deflected specific questions with the skill of someone protecting proprietary information while still building relationships. The subtle tensions in the room were becoming more apparent. Traditional energy representatives clustered together, their body language defensive. Renewable advocates formed their own informal groupings, speaking in excited whispers about breakthrough technologies and changing market dynamics. Government officials moved between both camps, maintaining careful neutrality, while clearly favoring whichever side seemed to offer better political opportunities.
Victoria's phone buzzed with a text message from her chief financial officer back at headquarters in Denver. The final signatures had been collected. All regulatory approvals were in place. The press releases were written and ready. $4 billion in committed funding from a consortium of international investors, pension funds, and sovereign wealth funds, the largest single renewable energy investment in American corporate history. She slipped her phone back into her purse and surveyed the room one final time before the main presentation session would begin. Wellington was still surrounded by his traditional energy allies, their conversation growing more animated as they discussed strategies for undermining renewable subsidies and promoting coal-friendly legislation. The moderator called the room to attention, announcing that the main presentation session would begin in 5 minutes. Victoria made her way toward the front of the room, where a small group of speakers were gathering near the podium. The morning's presentations had been warm-up acts. Now comes the main event. She checked her presentation materials one final time, though she could deliver this talk without notes. 3 years of preparation, countless nights refining financial models, thousands of hours negotiating with investors across 4 continents. Everything led to this moment, this room, this opportunity to fundamentally shift how America powered itself. Wellington noticed her near the podium and frowned slightly. He leaned over to whisper something to his chief of staff, a thin man with nervous eyes who immediately began typing on his smartphone. Victoria could feel the weight of their attention, the subtle hostility of people who viewed her presence as an intrusion into their carefully ordered world. The room fell quiet as the moderator stepped to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. We're ready to begin this afternoon's presentation session." Victoria straightened her shoulders, feeling the familiar calm that settled over her before important moments. This was what she had trained for, prepared for, built her entire career toward. The stage was set, the players were in position, and Victoria Harris was about to change everything. Victoria's journey to this moment began 28 years earlier in a cramped apartment in Detroit's Corktown neighborhood. Her mother, Linda Harris, worked double shifts at Ford's River Rouge plant, coming home each night with grease under her fingernails and steel dust in her hair. Their two-bedroom apartment overlooked an abandoned lot where wild sunflowers somehow managed to grow through cracked concrete, a daily reminder that life could flourish even in the most unlikely circumstances. At 6 years old, Victoria would sit by the window doing homework while waiting for her mother to return from work. The Detroit Edison power plant dominated the skyline across the river, its smokestacks belching gray clouds that turned orange in the setting sun. She didn't understand then why her mother would sometimes stop what she was doing to stare out at those stacks, her jaw tight with something Victoria would later recognize as quiet fury. The asthma started when Victoria turned 8. Emergency room visits became routine during the summer months when air quality dropped and the plant ran at full capacity. Dr. Martinez at Detroit Children's Hospital knew them by name, and his gentle questions about their address always made Linda's face harden. He prescribed inhalers and air purifiers they couldn't afford, while carefully not mentioning the correlation between their zip code and Victoria's breathing problems. Linda Harris had grown up in Alabama during the Civil Rights era, the daughter of a sharecropper who lost his farm when mechanization made small cotton operations obsolete. She had worked in textile mills until those jobs moved overseas, then in automotive plants until automation eliminated her position. Each economic transition had promised better opportunities that somehow never materialized for families like theirs. But she had learned something valuable from each displacement. Adaptability was survival, and education was the only reliable ladder out of poverty. Victoria's earliest memories of her mother involved numbers. Not bedtime stories, but financial calculations spoken aloud as Linda balanced their budget at the kitchen table. "If we skip cable this month, we can afford your school supplies. If I pick up overtime on Saturday, we can get your inhaler refilled." Mathematics wasn't abstract in their household. It was the difference between having heat in January and wearing coats inside. The neighborhood library became Victoria's sanctuary. Mrs. Washington, the elderly librarian, noticed the 8-year-old who arrived every afternoon and stayed until closing time. She began recommending books that challenged her understanding of how the world worked. Biographies of Katherine Johnson and Dorothy Vaughan introduced her to the possibility that mathematics could be a weapon against systemic exclusion. Stories about Marie Curie and Rosalind Franklin showed her that science could be both discovery and rebellion.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When Victoria turned 10, the plant across the river had a malfunction that sent black smoke billowing across their neighborhood for 3 days. Schools closed, residents were advised to stay indoors, and the hospital emergency room overflowed with children having respiratory crises. Victoria spent those days watching from their apartment window as news crews interviewed plant officials who spoke in careful corporate language about minor operational irregularities and acceptable emission levels. That night, Linda Harris sat on Victoria's bed and spoke with unusual directness about the world they lived in. Some people make decisions that affect other people's lives, and they never have to live with the consequences of those decisions. The man who runs that plant drives home to Grosse Pointe every night, where the air is clean and the hospitals are well funded. We breathe what he profits from, but he sleeps easy because he never sees our faces. The lesson wasn't about victimhood. It was about power.
Linda explained how regulatory agencies were staffed by former industry executives, how environmental impact studies were conducted by consulting firms paid by the companies being regulated, how community input meetings were scheduled at times when working parents couldn't attend. The system wasn't broken, it was working exactly as designed, just not for people like them. Victoria's academic performance attracted attention from teachers who recognized unusual potential. Mrs. Foster, her sixth-grade math teacher, spent lunch periods introducing her to algebraic concepts that wouldn't normally be taught for 2 more years. Mr. Thompson, her eighth-grade science teacher, arranged for her to attend Saturday enrichment programs at the University of Michigan, where she learned about chemical engineering and environmental science from graduate students who looked nothing like her. High school brought new challenges. Cass Technical High School was academically rigorous, but the guidance counselors consistently steered students of color toward practical trades rather than 4-year universities. When Victoria expressed interest in engineering, Mrs. Patterson suggested nursing instead. When she mentioned MIT, she was encouraged to consider community college first to build up her academic credentials. Linda Harris attended every parent-teacher conference armed with Victoria's test scores and a quiet determination that had been forged in Alabama cotton fields and Michigan assembly lines. She spoke with the measured precision of someone who had learned to navigate institutional bias without triggering defensive reactions. Victoria needs to be in advanced placement classes. Victoria should be taking calculus as a junior. Victoria will be applying to top-tier engineering programs. The financial reality of college applications was daunting. Each application fee represented a significant expense for their household. SAT preparation courses cost more than their monthly grocery budget. College visits required taking unpaid time off work and covering travel expenses they couldn't afford. But Linda had been saving for years, contributing $20 from each paycheck to a college fund that grew with painful slowness. Victoria's application essays focused not on overcoming adversity, which felt like performing trauma for admissions committees, but on her technical projects and research interests. She had built a solar panel system for their apartment using salvaged materials and YouTube tutorials, reducing their electricity bill by 30%. She had designed an air filtration system for her bedroom using hardware store components and principles learned from online chemistry courses. The acceptance letter from Stanford arrived on a gray March afternoon, full scholarship, covering tuition, room, and board. Linda cried in their kitchen, not from relief, but from vindication. Every sacrifice, every double shift, every time she had chosen Victoria's future over immediate comfort had led to this moment. Victoria would have opportunities that had been systematically denied to previous generations of their family. Stanford was a revelation and a challenge. Victoria excelled in her engineering coursework, but struggled with the cultural expectations of an environment where many students treated academic excellence as a birthright rather than a hard-won achievement. Study groups often met in off-campus locations she couldn't afford to frequent. Networking events assumed familiarity with cultural references and social codes she had never learned. Her sophomore year, Victoria joined a research project led by Dr. Rebecca Patterson, investigating grid-scale energy storage solutions. The work was technically fascinating, but also deeply personal. Every battery chemistry formula and efficiency calculation connected back to that Detroit power plant, to the asthma inhalers, to the nights her mother had stared out the window at those smokestacks. During spring break of her junior year, instead of traveling with classmates to vacation destinations, Victoria returned to Detroit to visit her mother. The old neighborhood looked different. Some blocks were being gentrified, while others had been abandoned entirely. The power plant was still there, still belching smoke, still affecting the health of families who had no choice about where they lived. She spent that week in the library where Mrs. Washington had first encouraged her academic ambitions, researching renewable energy projects and their economic impacts on low-income communities. The data told a clear story. Clean energy wasn't just an environmental imperative, it was an economic justice issue. Communities that had been harmed by fossil fuel infrastructure deserved to benefit from the transition to sustainable alternatives.
Her senior thesis project focused on distributed energy systems for urban environments, particularly how solar and battery installations could reduce both environmental impact and energy costs for low-income households. The research attracted attention from venture capital firms looking for investment opportunities in the clean energy sector. But Victoria was wary of solutions that would simply replace one form of economic extraction with another. After graduation, job offers poured in from established energy companies, technology giants, and consulting firms. The salaries were substantial, the career paths clearly defined, and the opportunities for advancement significant. But Victoria had learned from her mother's experience that individual success within unjust systems could be its own form of complicity. Instead, she moved to Denver and began working for a small renewable energy nonprofit, earning barely enough to cover basic expenses while learning the regulatory, financial, and political complexities of the energy sector. She spent her evenings and weekends developing business plans for distributed energy projects, building relationships with community organizations, and studying successful models from other countries. The nonprofit work taught her how environmental policy actually got made, who influenced regulatory decisions, and how community input could be systematically ignored through procedural complexity. She learned to navigate zoning boards and environmental impact assessments, to build coalitions between environmental groups and social justice organizations, to translate technical concepts into language that made sense to elected officials and community leaders. After 3 years, Victoria had identified the key barriers preventing large-scale renewable energy deployment: fragmented regulatory frameworks, insufficient grid infrastructure, limited access to capital, and resistance from established energy companies. The solutions weren't just technical, they were systemic. Someone needed to build a company large enough to influence markets, sophisticated enough to navigate regulatory complexity, and committed enough to prioritize community benefit over maximum extraction.
Phoenix Energy Solutions began as a business plan written in Victoria's studio apartment, funded with student loan money and credit card advances. The name was deliberate, something rising from the ashes of a destructive system, reborn with the power to nurture rather than harm. She spent 6 months refining financial models, researching international investors, and building relationships with technical experts who shared her vision for systemic change. The first funding round was modest, $5 million from impact investors who were more interested in social returns than maximum profitability. Victoria used the capital to hire her core team: Dr. James Chen as Chief Technology Officer, Maria Rodriguez as Head of Regulatory Affairs, and Kevin Johnson as Chief Financial Officer. Each brought expertise she needed, but more importantly, each brought personal commitment to the mission of environmental justice. 3 years of careful growth followed: strategic acquisitions of small solar installation companies, partnerships with community development organizations, pilot projects that demonstrated both technical feasibility and community benefit, media coverage that focused on their innovative approaches rather than Victoria's personal story. Slowly, Phoenix Energy Solutions built the reputation and relationships necessary for larger opportunities. The breakthrough came 18 months ago, when the European Investment Bank approved a preliminary investment framework for large-scale renewable projects in the United States. Victoria spent 9 months in meetings across London, Frankfurt, and Copenhagen, presenting technical specifications, financial projections, and community impact assessments to committees of international investors who controlled hundreds of billions in capital. Now, standing in that Chicago conference room with her presentation materials, Victoria carried not just her own ambitions, but the accumulated hopes of everyone who had invested in her success. Her mother, working night shifts to pay for college applications; Mrs. Washington, encouraging intellectual curiosity in a neighborhood library; Dr. Patterson, teaching grid-scale engineering to a young woman who understood that technology could be a tool for justice. The $4 billion deal represented more than financial victory. It was validation that sustainable energy could be profitable, that community-centered development could scale, that systemic change was possible through strategic economic pressure rather than just political advocacy.
Victoria was about to prove that the future belonged to people who understood that environmental protection and economic development weren't contradictory goals. She looked around the room one final time before the presentations would begin, mentally preparing for the moment when everything would change. The first sign of trouble came during the networking session before lunch. Victoria was discussing grid modernization challenges with Dr. Elena Rodriguez from the Department of Energy when she noticed a familiar pattern developing around her. Conversations would pause mid-sentence when she approached groups of investors. Handshakes became noticeably brief. Eye contact shifted away just a fraction too quickly. Marcus Wellington's chief of staff, Robert Thornton, had been busy during the morning break. His whispered conversations with key attendees followed a predictable script. Thornton had perfected the art of character assassination through seemingly innocent questions. "Do we know much about Phoenix Energy Solutions? I haven't seen their financials reported anywhere. It's interesting how some companies avoid transparency requirements, don't you think?" Senator Patricia Caldwell, who had been warm and engaging during their earlier conversation about renewable energy legislation, now seemed distracted when Victoria attempted to continue their discussion. The senator's aide kept checking his watch and interrupting with urgent reminders about other commitments. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Victoria had been relegated from potential ally to inconvenient petitioner. During the lunch service, Victoria found herself increasingly isolated at her assigned table. The nameplate next to hers read Thomas Bradley, CEO of Midwest Solar Solutions, but his seat remained conspicuously empty throughout the meal. Later, she would learn that Bradley had been moved to Wellington's table at the last minute, a small accommodation that spoke volumes about the conference's real power dynamics. Dr. Michael Foster from the Illinois Institute of Technology, seated across from her, made polite conversation about renewable energy research, but his questions carried an undercurrent of skepticism that hadn't been present earlier. How exactly does Phoenix Energy Solutions plan to scale without established utility partnerships? The regulatory barriers alone seem insurmountable for a company of your size. His tone suggested genuine academic curiosity, but Victoria recognized the talking points that had been carefully planted. The afternoon presentation schedule had been subtly modified. Victoria's slot, originally positioned prominently after lunch, had been moved to later in the program. The moderator explained it as a minor scheduling adjustment to accommodate Senator Caldwell's early departure, but the real message was clear. Her presentation was no longer considered essential viewing for the conference's most important attendees. Wellington himself seemed to be everywhere during the afternoon sessions, moving between conversations with the confident ease of someone orchestrating events from behind the scenes. His presence at each group Victoria approached was not coincidental. It was strategic. He would arrive moments after she did, his booming laugh and familiar handshakes naturally drawing attention away from whatever technical discussion she had been developing. The most devastating blow came during the renewable energy panel discussion. Victoria had been invited to participate alongside 3 other clean energy executives, but when she arrived at the designated conference room, she found the panel had been restructured. Dr. Amanda Lewis from Tesla's energy division apologized with obvious discomfort. "There seems to have been some confusion about the panel composition. We've had to limit participation to publicly traded companies for regulatory disclosure reasons." The explanation was professionally delivered but transparently false. Victoria knew the securities regulations as well as anyone in the room. They didn't require such restrictions for conference panels. But challenging the decision would have created exactly the kind of scene that Wellington wanted, an angry confrontation that would confirm stereotypes about emotional outbursts and professional inadequacy. Instead, Victoria smiled graciously and took a seat in the audience, using the opportunity to study her competition and refine her own messaging. She watched Dr. Lewis discuss Tesla's energy storage projects with expertise and passion, noting which technical details resonated with the audience and which regulatory concerns generated the most pointed questions. The panel members were clearly knowledgeable, but their presentations lacked the comprehensive vision that Victoria had spent 3 years developing. During the question-and-answer session, Victoria raised her hand to ask about grid integration challenges for large-scale renewable projects. Her question was technically sophisticated and demonstrated a deep understanding of infrastructure limitations that most renewable energy companies simply ignored. The panel members' answers revealed the exact gaps in their strategies that Phoenix Energy Solutions had been designed to address. Wellington watched from the back of the room, his expression unreadable, but his attention focused entirely on Victoria's interaction with the panel. When she asked a follow-up question about international investment frameworks for domestic renewable projects, his posture shifted slightly. The question revealed knowledge that a mere mid-level executive should not possess, understanding of financial structures that required years of high-level negotiations to acquire. After the panel concluded, Victoria found herself surrounded by investors and industry professionals who had been impressed by her questions. Her business cards disappeared quickly as conversations developed around specific technical challenges and potential collaboration opportunities. For a brief moment, the morning's isolation seemed to be lifting. But Wellington's influence extended beyond direct manipulation. James Mitchell from Blackstone Energy approached Victoria with obvious enthusiasm about potential partnership opportunities, but their conversation was interrupted by a phone call that he took with visible anxiety. When he returned, his demeanor had changed completely. "I should mention that we're exploring several strategic directions right now. Perhaps we could reconnect in 6 months when our priorities are clearer." The pattern repeated throughout the afternoon. Initial interest followed by sudden reluctance. Enthusiastic conversations cut short by urgent phone calls or pressing obligations. Victoria began to recognize the systematic nature of what was happening. This wasn't random market skepticism, but coordinated professional sabotage. The technology demonstration session provided temporary relief. Victoria had brought a tablet loaded with Phoenix Energy Solutions' proprietary software for modeling distributed energy systems. When Dr. Sarah Chen asked about grid optimization algorithms, Victoria was able to provide a live demonstration that left several attendees genuinely impressed. The software could model energy flow patterns across complex networks in real time, optimizing distribution efficiency while minimizing infrastructure costs. But even technical excellence couldn't overcome systematic exclusion. When the demonstration concluded and several investors expressed interest in scheduling follow-up meetings, Victoria discovered that her business cards had somehow disappeared from the conference networking database. Attendees who wanted to contact her had no way to find her information through official channels. The late afternoon break brought the most direct confrontation yet. Victoria was standing near the coffee station when Wellington approached, flanked by 2 men she didn't recognize. His smile was perfectly calibrated, warm enough to appear friendly to observers, cold enough to convey threat to its intended target. "Ms. Harris, isn't it? I don't believe we've been properly introduced. Marcus Wellington, Wellington Industries." His handshake was firm but brief, a demonstration of controlled power. "I've been hearing interesting things about your company. Phoenix Energy Solutions, correct? Quite an ambitious name for such a young organization." The conversation that followed was a masterclass in corporate intimidation disguised as professional curiosity. Wellington's questions were technically sophisticated, designed to expose any weaknesses in Phoenix Energy Solutions' business model or technical capabilities. His tone remained perfectly cordial, while his words carried clear implications about regulatory scrutiny, financial transparency, and industry relationships. "I'm sure you understand how important due diligence becomes when we're discussing projects of significant scale. The energy sector has particular requirements for established partnerships and proven track records. Regulatory agencies tend to be quite thorough in their reviews, especially when international financing is involved." His meaning was unmistakable. He had the connections to make her life very difficult if she persisted in challenging his dominance. Victoria responded with calm professionalism, answering his technical questions with precision while avoiding the trap of appearing defensive or confrontational. She knew that every word was being evaluated, not just by Wellington, but by the small crowd of industry professionals who had gathered within listening distance. Any sign of weakness or uncertainty would be amplified throughout the conference network within hours. The conversation concluded with Wellington extending an invitation to visit his offices for a more detailed discussion about potential collaboration opportunities. His tone suggested genuine interest in partnership, but Victoria understood the subtext: submit to his authority, or face systematic destruction of her business relationships. As the afternoon sessions concluded, Victoria began to grasp the full scope of what she was facing. Wellington's influence extended far beyond his own company. He had cultivated relationships throughout the traditional energy ecosystem that allowed him to coordinate responses to potential threats. Regulatory agencies, financial institutions, political networks, media relationships all could be mobilized to contain challenges to the established order. The networking reception provided final confirmation of her isolated position. Conversations that had begun with enthusiasm during the morning sessions now felt strained and artificial. Business cards that had been eagerly exchanged earlier were now offered with visible reluctance. The professional community that had seemed open to new ideas had closed ranks against the outsider who threatened existing arrangements. Wellington's strategy was becoming clear. He didn't need to directly attack Phoenix Energy Solutions or personally discredit Victoria. He simply needed to demonstrate the costs of challenging his authority, the professional isolation that awaited anyone who refused to acknowledge his dominance. The message was being communicated throughout the industry network with subtle efficiency. But Victoria had anticipated this reaction. Her 3 years of careful preparation had included contingency planning for exactly this kind of systematic resistance. Wellington's response confirmed that Phoenix Energy Solutions represented a genuine threat to established interests, validation that her strategy was targeting the right vulnerabilities in the traditional energy system. The evening's final presentation slot was approaching, and Victoria knew that her moment was coming. Wellington had succeeded in isolating her professionally and demonstrated his power to manipulate industry relationships. But he had also revealed his weaknesses: the need to control narratives, the reliance on personal relationships rather than market fundamentals, and the assumption that financial pressure could overcome technical innovation. Victoria checked her presentation materials one final time, knowing that everything would change within the next hour. Wellington had won the day's tactical battles, but the war was about to shift dramatically in her favor. Victoria excused herself from the reception and found refuge in the building's executive lounge on the 39th floor. The space was quieter, designed for private phone calls and confidential meetings. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of Lake Michigan, where cargo ships moved slowly across the darkening water. She needed 15 minutes of solitude to execute the final phase of her strategy. Her phone buzzed with a secure message from Kevin Johnson, her chief financial officer back in Denver. All documentation has been uploaded to the secure server. Press releases are staged for simultaneous release across 14 international markets. Legal teams in London, Frankfurt, and Singapore have confirmed regulatory compliance. We're ready to execute on your signal. She smiled, remembering the 18 months of meticulous preparation that had led to this moment. While Wellington had been relying on personal relationships and industry connections, she had been building something far more substantial, a coalition of international investors who shared her vision for systematic change in global energy markets.
The European Investment Bank had been her first breakthrough, but it was far from her only success. Pension funds from Norway's sovereign wealth system controlled by environmental mandates. Insurance companies from Switzerland seeking stable returns from climate-resilient infrastructure. Sovereign development funds from Singapore and South Korea positioning for the next phase of economic growth. Each represented not just capital, but institutional commitment to the transition away from fossil fuel dependence. She opened her tablet and reviewed the final presentation slides one more time, though she could deliver this content from memory. The numbers were staggering, even to her. $4 billion in committed funding, with an additional $6 billion in conditional commitments contingent on successful deployment of the initial projects. Regulatory approvals from 47 states, 3 federal agencies, and 12 international jurisdictions. Purchase agreements with municipalities representing over 30 million residents. But the presentation wasn't really about numbers. It was about demonstrating the irreversible momentum behind renewable energy transformation. Victoria had learned from studying Wellington's own rise to power 3 decades earlier.
He had succeeded not by building the best technology or offering the lowest prices, but by making his competitors' business models obsolete before they understood what was happening. Her strategy followed the same playbook, but in reverse. While traditional energy companies fought political battles over regulatory frameworks, Phoenix Energy Solutions had been quietly securing the technical partnerships and financial commitments that would make those regulations irrelevant. When renewable energy could be deployed faster and cheaper than fossil fuel alternatives, political opposition became economically unsustainable. The tablet chimed with an encrypted video call from Dr. Lu Wei in Shanghai. The timing was perfect. Victoria had scheduled this final coordination call for exactly this moment. Dr. Lu represented the China Energy Investment Corporation, which controlled over $200 billion in global infrastructure development funds. Victoria, the documentation has been reviewed by our technical committee. Your grid integration protocols exceed anything we've seen from American companies. The community benefit frameworks are particularly impressive. We're prepared to proceed with the full commitment as discussed. Their conversation lasted exactly 8 minutes, covering final details about technology transfer agreements, regulatory compliance timelines, and community impact measurements. Dr. Lu's team had spent 6 months evaluating Phoenix Energy Solutions' technical capabilities and financial projections. Their commitment represented not just investment capital, but validation from the world's largest infrastructure development organization. The second call came from Dr. Ingrid Larsson in Stockholm, representing the Nordic Investment Bank. The Nordic approach to renewable energy development had become the global standard for sustainable economic growth, and their participation in the Phoenix Energy Solutions Consortium lent crucial credibility to the entire project. We've completed our environmental impact assessments across all proposed sites. The carbon reduction projections are conservative, which gives us confidence in long-term performance. Our board has authorized full participation in the first phase deployment. The political risk insurance is already in place. Victoria's phone showed 14 missed calls from various members of her executive team, all confirming final preparations for the announcement. Maria Rodriguez had secured environmental impact certifications from every relevant regulatory agency. Dr. James Chen had completed final testing on the energy storage systems that would differentiate Phoenix Energy Solutions from competitors. The legal team had finalized intellectual property protections across 17 countries. She pulled up the presentation remote and tested the wireless connection to the conference room's audio-visual system. The slides were loaded, the backup systems were confirmed, and the technical demonstration was ready. But more importantly, she had verified that the conference organizers couldn't suddenly experience technical difficulties that would prevent her presentation from being delivered. The real genius of her strategy lay not in the scale of the financial commitment, but in its structure. Traditional energy investments required massive upfront capital with returns dependent on commodity price fluctuations and regulatory stability. Phoenix Energy Solutions had designed a distributed model where initial investments generated immediate returns through efficiency improvements, with additional profits flowing from technology licensing and community partnership agreements. Wellington's business model assumed that energy production required centralized control of large-scale infrastructure, with profits extracted through monopolistic pricing and regulatory capture. Victoria had proven that distributed energy systems could deliver better performance at lower costs while generating profits for local communities rather than distant shareholders. Her tablet displayed real-time data from Phoenix Energy Solutions pilot projects across 12 states. Solar installations in Arizona were exceeding projected efficiency by 18%. Wind farms in Kansas were delivering power at costs 30% below regional averages. Battery storage systems in Texas were providing grid stabilization services that traditional utilities couldn't match with their aging infrastructure. But the most compelling numbers came from community impact measurements. Property values in neighborhoods with Phoenix Energy installations had increased by an average of 12%. Local employment had grown through technical training programs and maintenance contracts. Energy costs for low-income households had decreased by an average of 35%, freeing up resources for education, healthcare, and economic development. Victoria stood and walked to the windows, looking down at the conference participants gathered on the terrace 37 floors below. From this height, their networking conversations and power dynamics seemed insignificant against the broader economic forces that were reshaping global energy markets. Wellington's influence was substantial within traditional industry circles, but those circles were becoming increasingly irrelevant to actual market outcomes. Her phone buzzed with a message from her mother back in Detroit. "I've been watching the stock market today. Wind energy companies are up across the board. The Detroit News is reporting that Ford is switching to renewable power for all their Michigan plants. Things are changing faster than anyone expected. I'm proud of what you're building." The message reminded Victoria that this moment was about more than financial success or professional vindication. The communities that had been harmed by decades of fossil fuel pollution deserved to benefit from the transition to sustainable energy systems. Environmental justice wasn't just a marketing slogan. It was the organizing principle that had guided every strategic decision Phoenix Energy Solutions had made. She reviewed the final sequence of her presentation, mentally rehearsing the transitions between technical specifications and community impact measurements. The audience would include skeptics who questioned whether renewable energy could achieve the scale and reliability required for modern economic systems. Her response needed to be comprehensive enough to address technical concerns while accessible enough to communicate with financial investors who weren't engineering specialists.
The presentation timeline was carefully structured to build momentum through cumulative revelations. Initial slides would establish technical credibility through pilot project performance data. Middle sections would demonstrate financial viability through detailed cost comparisons and profit projections. The conclusion would reveal the full scope of committed investments and regulatory approvals that made immediate large-scale deployment possible. But the real power of her presentation lay in what it revealed about the speakers who had preceded her throughout the day. Every renewable energy company represented at the conference was thinking in terms of incremental improvements to existing systems. Phoenix Energy Solutions had designed a replacement system that made existing infrastructure economically obsolete. Victoria checked her watch and realized that her presentation slot was approaching. She gathered her materials and headed toward the elevator, knowing that everything was in place for the most important 15 minutes of her professional career. Wellington's afternoon strategy of isolation and intimidation had succeeded tactically, but it had also positioned him perfectly for the strategic reversal that was about to unfold. The elevator descended through 40 floors of Chicago's financial district, past offices where energy companies, investment banks, and regulatory agencies made decisions that affected millions of people who had never set foot in buildings like this. Victoria carried with her the power to demonstrate that those decisions could be made differently, with different priorities and different beneficiaries. As the elevator doors opened onto the 37th floor, Victoria could hear the conference moderator beginning his introduction for the final presentation of the day. The audience was smaller than it had been in the morning. Some attendees had left early, others were networking in adjacent rooms, and a few were clearly checking emails rather than paying attention to the proceedings. Wellington sat in the front row, his attention focused on his smartphone rather than the podium. His body language conveyed casual dismissal of whatever technical presentation was about to be delivered by the young woman who had been systematically marginalized throughout the day's events. He had succeeded in demonstrating his power to control industry relationships and professional opportunities. Victoria walked toward the podium with calm confidence, knowing that everything was about to change. The next 15 minutes would prove that sustainable energy development could achieve the scale and profitability required to transform global markets. More importantly, it would demonstrate that environmental justice and economic success weren't contradictory goals, but complementary strategies for building systems that served communities rather than exploiting them.
She approached the microphone and looked out at the audience, many of whom were meeting her for the first time, most of whom had no idea what they were about to witness. The presentation remote felt solid in her hand, the slides were loaded correctly, and her voice was steady as she began to speak. The moment had arrived to prove that the future belonged to people who understood that innovation and justice could be the same thing. Victoria's voice cut through the conference room chatter with unexpected authority. Good evening. I'm Victoria Harris, founder and chief executive officer of Phoenix Energy Solutions. Today, I'm here to announce the completion of the largest renewable energy investment in American corporate history. The room's energy shifted immediately. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Smartphones were lowered. Even Wellington looked up from his device, his expression shifting from casual dismissal to sharp attention. The moderator, caught off guard by the directness of her opening, fumbled briefly with his notes before settling back into his chair. Victoria advanced the first slide, which displayed a simple logo, Phoenix Energy Solutions, accompanied by a tagline that hadn't appeared in any of their previous public materials: powering communities, transforming markets, building justice. The design was elegant and understated, but the message was unmistakably bold. Over the past 36 months, Phoenix Energy Solutions has secured $4 billion in committed investment from an international consortium of institutional investors, sovereign wealth funds, and development banks. These commitments represent not just capital, but institutional validation of our distributed energy model and community-centered development approach. The second slide revealed the scope of their investor coalition in a format that left the audience stunned. The European Investment Bank logo appeared first, followed by China Energy Investment Corporation, Nordic Investment Bank, Singapore Sovereign Development Fund, and 12 other institutional investors whose combined assets exceeded $2 trillion. Dr. Sarah Chen, who had been casually checking her email, straightened in her seat and began taking notes rapidly. Jennifer Walsh, the Illinois Energy Secretary, leaned forward with obvious interest. Even the journalists who had been preparing to leave early were now focused intently on Victoria's presentation. But it was Wellington's reaction that commanded attention throughout the room. His face had gone pale, his confident posture replaced by rigid tension. The smartphone in his hands was forgotten as he stared at the investor logos displayed on the massive conference room screen. His chief of staff, Robert Thornton, was typing frantically on his tablet, presumably researching the institutional investors whose commitments Victoria had just announced. The third slide detailed the regulatory approvals that Phoenix Energy Solutions had secured across federal, state, and international jurisdictions. Environmental impact assessments approved by the EPA. Grid integration permits from 47 state public utility commissions. Technology transfer agreements with agencies in 14 countries. Import-export licenses for specialized equipment manufactured in Germany and Denmark. Victoria's presentation style was methodical and authoritative, each slide building systematically on the previous information. She spoke without notes, her technical knowledge evident in the precision of her language and the confidence of her delivery. This wasn't a startup seeking investment. This was an established enterprise announcing operational deployment. The fourth slide revealed the pilot project performance data that had convinced international investors of Phoenix Energy Solutions' technical capabilities. Solar installations delivering 18% above projected efficiency. Wind systems operating at capacity factors that exceeded industry standards. Battery storage providing grid stabilization services that traditional utilities couldn't match with existing infrastructure.
Senator Patricia Caldwell was now completely focused on the presentation, her earlier distraction replaced by obvious professional interest.
The networking conversations in adjacent rooms had ceased as word spread that something significant was happening in the main conference room. Attendees who had left early were being called back by colleagues who recognized the historic nature of what they were witnessing. Victoria advanced to the fifth slide, which displayed a map of the United States marked with red dots representing confirmed project sites: Arizona, Nevada, Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, Iowa, Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania. 47 locations across 12 states, each representing community partnerships and local economic development agreements. These projects will generate over 12,000 direct employment opportunities in manufacturing, installation, and maintenance operations. Our community partnership model ensures that 60% of these positions will be filled by local residents, with comprehensive technical training provided through partnerships with regional educational institutions. The employment numbers hit the audience like a physical force. 12,000 jobs represented economic impact that politicians and business leaders could immediately understand. But Victoria's emphasis on local hiring and technical training revealed a development model that prioritized community benefit over profit extraction. Wellington's reaction was becoming increasingly visible to everyone in the room. His jaw was clenched tight, his knuckles white as he gripped his smartphone. The confident dominance he had displayed throughout the day was cracking under the weight of realizing that he had completely misunderstood the nature of the threat he was facing. The sixth slide revealed the financial structure that had made such massive investment possible. Unlike traditional energy projects that required enormous upfront capital with uncertain long-term returns, Phoenix Energy Solutions had designed a distributed model where initial efficiency improvements generated immediate cash flow that funded subsequent expansion. Our distributed energy systems reduce consumer costs by an average of 35% while generating profits through efficiency licensing, technology transfer agreements, and community development partnerships. This model allows for rapid scaling without the debt burdens that have constrained traditional renewable energy deployment. Dr. Michael Foster from the Illinois Institute of Technology was now asking his graduate assistant to record the presentation on her smartphone. The technical details Victoria was presenting represented breakthrough innovations in project financing and community development that academic researchers had been theorizing about for years. Victoria advanced to the seventh slide, which displayed real-time performance data from existing installations. The numbers updated every few seconds, showing current energy production, grid contribution, and cost savings across their 12-state pilot network. The technology demonstration was subtle but devastating. Phoenix Energy Solutions wasn't just announcing future plans, but proving current operational capability. The eighth slide contained the information that transformed the entire conference. Partnership agreements with municipal governments representing over 30 million residents, utility integration contracts that bypassed traditional monopolistic pricing structures, economic development zones that prioritized sustainable infrastructure over fossil fuel extraction. These partnerships represent more than procurement agreements. They constitute a fundamental shift in how American communities approach energy independence and economic development. We're not just replacing fossil fuel infrastructure, we're building systems that serve community needs rather than extracting community wealth. The audience was now completely silent, except for the sound of rapid note-taking and whispered conversations. Victoria's presentation had revealed not just a successful business venture, but a systematic alternative to the energy development model that had dominated American markets for decades. Wellington finally stood up, his movement abrupt and awkward. His face was flushed, his earlier confidence replaced by obvious agitation. He began walking toward the exit, but stopped when Victoria advanced to the 9th slide, which displayed a photograph of herself shaking hands with Dr. Liu Wei outside the Shanghai offices of China Energy Investment Corporation. The photograph was dated 3 months earlier, but its implications were immediate and devastating. Victoria had been negotiating with the world's largest infrastructure investment organization, while Wellington had been treating her as insignificant staff. His entire assessment of the competitive landscape had been fundamentally wrong. Victoria's voice remained calm and professional as she continued her presentation, but her eyes found Wellington's across the room. The moment stretched between them, loaded with the weight of his earlier dismissal and her systematic preparation for this exact confrontation. The 10th slide revealed the final component of Phoenix Energy Solutions' strategy: intellectual property portfolios that would reshape competitive dynamics across the entire renewable energy sector. Patents on grid integration technologies, community development frameworks, and distributed energy management systems that made traditional utility models economically obsolete. Our technology licensing agreements will be available to any organization committed to community-centered development and environmental justice. We're not seeking to monopolize renewable energy markets. We're building systems that can be replicated and adapted to serve diverse community needs across different geographic and economic contexts. The audience erupted in applause that started slowly but built to sustained intensity. Cameras were flashing as journalists documented what they recognized as a historic moment in American energy development. The networking reception was forgotten as attendees crowded toward the podium, eager to schedule meetings and explore partnership opportunities. Wellington stood frozen near the conference room exit, his earlier words echoing with devastating irony. "I don't shake hands with staff." The woman he had dismissed as irrelevant had just announced the largest renewable energy investment in corporate history, backed by institutions that controlled more capital than his entire industry sector. Victoria remained at the podium, graciously accepting congratulations while maintaining the professional composure that had carried her through 18 months of international negotiations. She had proven that sustainable energy could achieve the scale and profitability required to transform markets. More importantly, she had demonstrated that environmental justice and economic success weren't contradictory goals. The reversal was complete. Wellington's influence had been revealed as fundamentally dependent on information asymmetry and relationship manipulation. Victoria's power was based on technical innovation, community partnership, and international institutional support. The future belonged to people who understood that serving communities and generating profits could be the same thing. The conference room had transformed into a hub of frantic activity within minutes of Victoria's presentation ending. Journalists were making urgent phone calls to editors, their voices overlapping as they tried to explain the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. Business reporters were already crafting headlines that would dominate financial news cycles for weeks. Energy sector analysts were frantically updating their market projections and industry forecasts. Dr. Sarah Chen pushed through the crowd surrounding Victoria, her academic composure replaced by visible excitement. "This changes everything we thought we knew about renewable energy scaling. The community partnership model alone represents a complete paradigm shift. I need to get my research team connected with your technical staff."
Senator Patricia Caldwell was equally direct in her approach, though her interest was clearly political as well as policy-driven. "Ms. Harris, I need to schedule a meeting with my Energy Committee staff as soon as possible. The implications for federal renewable energy legislation are substantial. We've been working with outdated assumptions about deployment timelines and community impact." But it was the reaction of the financial professionals that truly demonstrated the seismic nature of Victoria's announcement. Investment managers were placing calls to portfolio committees, restructuring energy sector allocations in real time.
Currency traders were analyzing the implications for renewable energy commodity markets. Insurance executives were recalculating risk assessments for fossil fuel infrastructure investments. Wellington had retreated to a corner of the room where his chief of staff was providing urgent updates on his tablet. Robert Thornton's face was ashen as he scrolled through preliminary market reactions that were already appearing on financial news feeds. Wellington Industries stock had dropped 4% in after-hours trading within 30 minutes of Victoria's presentation ending. The networking reception that followed moved to the building's executive terrace, but the atmosphere was completely different from the afternoon's carefully orchestrated social dynamics. Victoria found herself at the center of every significant conversation, with industry leaders who had ignored her hours earlier now competing for her attention. Thomas Bradley from Midwest Solar Solutions, who had been mysteriously moved away from her lunch table, approached with obvious embarrassment about the afternoon's events. "I owe you an apology for the scheduling confusion earlier. I should have realized that something wasn't right when my table assignment was changed at the last minute. I'd like to discuss potential partnership opportunities when you have time." The confession revealed the extent of Wellington's manipulation throughout the day, but Victoria responded with diplomatic grace rather than accusatory confrontation. "These things happen at conferences. I'm more interested in discussing how distributed energy systems can complement your existing solar installations across the Midwest region." Her response demonstrated the strategic thinking that had enabled Phoenix Energy Solutions to succeed where other renewable energy companies had struggled. Rather than focusing on competitive dominance, Victoria was building collaborative networks that could accelerate sustainable energy deployment across broader geographic and economic contexts. Dr. Elena Rodriguez from the Department of Energy was more direct about the political implications of Victoria's announcement. "The administration has been looking for large-scale renewable energy success stories that demonstrate job creation and community development. Your model addresses both environmental priorities and economic development concerns simultaneously." The conversation revealed how Victoria's strategy had anticipated political as well as economic challenges facing renewable energy development. Community partnership agreements and local employment commitments provided talking points that politicians could use to defend sustainable energy investments against fossil fuel industry lobbying. James Mitchell from Blackstone Energy, who had received the mysterious phone call that changed his demeanor earlier in the day, now seemed eager to rebuild the relationship that had been damaged by external pressure. "I should mention that we've reconsidered our strategic priorities based on this afternoon's presentations. Perhaps we could schedule a more detailed discussion about infrastructure financing opportunities." Victoria recognized the pattern of behavior that had repeated throughout the day: initial interest, sudden reluctance following external pressure, and renewed enthusiasm once Victoria's true position was revealed. The experience provided valuable insight into how Wellington's influence network operated and how it could be neutralized through superior positioning. The most significant reaction came from international attendees who understood the global implications of Victoria's announcement better than their American counterparts. Dr. Hans Mueller from the German Development Bank had been observing the proceedings with obvious interest in how American renewable energy development compared to European models. "What you've accomplished represents the first successful American adaptation of distributed energy frameworks that we've been implementing across Northern Europe for the past decade. The community development components are particularly sophisticated. We should discuss technology transfer opportunities that could accelerate deployment in both regions." His comments revealed how Phoenix Energy Solutions had studied international best practices rather than simply trying to scale existing American approaches. Victoria's global perspective had enabled innovations that domestic competitors hadn't considered because they were constrained by traditional thinking about energy markets and regulatory frameworks. Wellington's isolation was becoming increasingly visible as the evening progressed. Former allies were maintaining polite but noticeably distant interactions, their body language suggesting uncertainty about association with someone whose judgment had been so dramatically exposed.
The confident authority he had displayed throughout the day was replaced by defensive posturing and abbreviated conversations. The media reaction was immediate and devastating for Wellington's carefully cultivated public image. Financial journalists were already publishing analysis pieces questioning Wellington Industries' strategic position in rapidly changing energy markets. Environmental reporters were highlighting the contrast between Phoenix Energy Solutions' community-centered approach and traditional energy companies' extraction-focused business models. Energy sector stock prices were adjusting in real time as institutional investors recognized the implications of Victoria's announcement. Renewable energy companies saw immediate gains, while traditional fossil fuel stocks declined on concerns about accelerated market transformation. Wellington Industries was particularly vulnerable because their business model was most dependent on regulatory protection and monopolistic pricing structures. Social media amplification was extraordinary, with conference attendees posting photos and quotes from Victoria's presentation across professional networks. LinkedIn was flooded with commentary from energy industry professionals trying to analyze the strategic implications of Phoenix Energy Solutions' announcement. Twitter hashtags related to renewable energy and community development were trending nationally within hours. The contrast between Victoria's rising influence and Wellington's diminishing authority created a fascinating dynamic throughout the evening's networking activities. Conversations that had naturally gravitated toward Wellington during the afternoon now seemed to actively avoid him, while Victoria found herself declining more meeting requests than she could possibly accommodate. Mayor David Chen from Chicago was particularly interested in the municipal partnership opportunities that Victoria had outlined in her presentation. The city has been looking for renewable energy solutions that can deliver both environmental benefits and economic development simultaneously.
The conversation revealed how Victoria's strategy had anticipated local political as well as economic concerns. Urban mayors were facing pressure to reduce carbon emissions while also creating employment opportunities for working-class constituents. Phoenix Energy Solutions had designed frameworks that addressed both challenges through integrated approaches. Dr. Amanda Lewis from Tesla's Energy Division approached Victoria with a combination of professional respect and competitive curiosity. Your grid integration technologies represent significant advances over current industry standards. I'd like to understand whether there might be collaboration opportunities that could benefit both organizations. The discussion demonstrated how Victoria's innovations were being recognized by technical experts from established renewable energy companies. Rather than trying to compete directly with existing players, Phoenix Energy Solutions had developed complementary technologies that could enhance industry capabilities while maintaining competitive advantages. Wellington's attempt to salvage the situation came during the evening's closing remarks when he approached the podium to offer what he clearly intended as gracious commentary on the day's presentations. His words were carefully chosen, but his delivery lacked the commanding presence that had characterized his earlier appearances. Today's presentations have demonstrated the dynamic nature of energy markets and the importance of staying informed about emerging opportunities. Wellington Industries looks forward to continued dialogue with all conference participants about collaborative approaches to American energy development. The statement was diplomatically worded but transparently defensive, an attempt to reposition his afternoon's behavior as strategic caution rather than systematic prejudice. But the audience's lukewarm response revealed how completely the day's power dynamics had shifted. Wellington's influence depended on others believing in his authority. That belief had been fundamentally undermined. Victoria's response to Wellington's remarks was brief but definitive. She approached the microphone with the same calm confidence that had characterized her presentation, her words addressing the entire audience, while clearly directed at Wellington himself. Phoenix Energy Solutions believes that American energy independence and community economic development are compatible goals that can be achieved through collaborative partnerships with organizations committed to environmental justice and sustainable growth. We welcome conversations with any stakeholders who share those priorities. The applause that followed was sustained and enthusiastic,
But it also carried clear implications about which vision of energy development had captured the audience's imagination. Victoria had proven that technical innovation, community partnership, and environmental justice could generate the scale and profitability required to transform markets. Wellington left the conference early, his departure noticed but unremarked upon by attendees who were focused on the opportunities that Victoria's announcement had created. His influence network was already adjusting to new realities, with former allies beginning the delicate process of distancing themselves from his systematically exposed weaknesses. The evening concluded with Victoria scheduling dozens of follow-up meetings while maintaining the diplomatic grace that had enabled her international success. She had proven that sustainable energy development could achieve dominance through superior strategy rather than systematic exclusion. The future belonged to people who understood that environmental justice and economic success were complementary rather than competing priorities. 3 months after the Chicago conference, Victoria stood in her new corner office on the 42nd floor of a Denver skyscraper, watching the sunrise paint the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and amber. The view reminded her of those early mornings in Detroit, when she would sit by the window waiting for her mother to return from night shifts, dreaming of a world where power meant the ability to help rather than the privilege to harm. The transformation had been swift and decisive. Within weeks of her announcement, Phoenix Energy Solutions had become the most sought-after partnership in the renewable energy sector. The International Investment Consortium had accelerated their deployment timeline with groundbreaking ceremonies scheduled across 12 states over the next 18 months. But the numbers, impressive as they were, told only part of the story. Dr. Sarah Chen had published a groundbreaking research paper titled Distributed Energy Democracy: How Community-Centered Development Models Are Reshaping American Infrastructure. The academic validation mattered to Victoria, not for personal recognition, but because it provided an intellectual framework for other communities to adapt similar approaches to their own economic development challenges. The ripple effects extended far beyond energy markets. Urban planners were incorporating Phoenix Energy Solutions' community partnership model into affordable housing developments. Agricultural cooperatives were adapting their distributed ownership structures for rural renewable energy projects. Native American tribal governments were using their framework to develop energy independence initiatives that honored both environmental stewardship and economic sovereignty. Senator Patricia Caldwell introduced federal legislation called the Community Energy Independence Act, which provided tax incentives for renewable energy projects that met specific local employment and community benefit requirements. The bill had bipartisan support because it addressed both environmental concerns and economic development priorities that resonated across political divides. Victoria's phone buzzed with a message from her mother, who had become something of a local celebrity in Detroit after national media coverage of her daughter's success. "The community center is having a renewable energy workshop next week. They want me to share our story about how one family's dreams can change entire industries. I told them I'm proud to be known as Victoria Eris's mother." The role reversal made Victoria smile. For years, she had carried the weight of her mother's sacrifices and the responsibility to honor generations of struggle through her own achievements. Now, Linda Harris was using their story to inspire other families facing similar challenges, proving the transformation could flow in multiple directions simultaneously. The international impact had exceeded even Victoria's ambitious projections. The China Energy Investment Corporation had announced plans to adapt Phoenix Energy Solutions' community development model for rural infrastructure projects across Southeast Asia. The Nordic Investment Bank was funding similar initiatives throughout Eastern Europe. The distributed ownership frameworks that had been designed for American communities were proving applicable to diverse economic and cultural contexts. Dr. Hans Müller from the German Development Bank had become a frequent collaborator, coordinating technology transfer agreements that accelerated renewable energy deployment while ensuring that local communities retained control over their own economic development.
The partnerships demonstrated how environmental solutions could strengthen rather than undermine national sovereignty and cultural autonomy.
But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from unexpected sources. Tribal leaders from the Navajo Nation had invited Victoria to discuss how renewable energy development could support indigenous communities' efforts to achieve energy independence while protecting sacred lands from extractive industries. The conversations had led to partnerships that honored traditional ecological knowledge while incorporating cutting-edge technology. Wellington Industries had struggled to adapt to the new competitive landscape. Marcus Wellington himself had announced his retirement 6 weeks after the Chicago conference, citing personal reasons, but clearly recognizing that his leadership style was incompatible with rapidly changing industry dynamics. The company's stock price had stabilized, but only after replacing their entire executive team and committing to community-centered development approaches that directly contradicted decades of corporate culture. The business media had been merciless in their analysis of Wellington's downfall. Harvard Business Review published a case study titled "The Costs of Corporate Arrogance: How Personal Bias Can Destroy Competitive Intelligence." The Financial Times ran a series examining how traditional energy companies' reliance on political relationships had blinded them to technological and economic disruptions that were reshaping global markets. Victoria found no satisfaction in Wellington's professional difficulties. His behavior at the conference had been symptomatic of systemic problems that extended far beyond individual prejudice. The real victory wasn't his downfall, but the demonstration that alternative approaches could succeed by serving community needs rather than exploiting community vulnerabilities. The employment impact had been transformative for communities that had been devastated by previous economic transitions. Coal mining regions in West Virginia were retraining workers for solar panel installation and maintenance. Rust Belt cities were manufacturing wind turbine components in former automotive plants. Oil refining communities along the Gulf Coast were adapting their technical expertise for offshore wind development. Maria Rodriguez, Phoenix Energy Solutions' head of regulatory affairs, had developed training partnerships with community colleges across 47 states. The programs combined technical education with entrepreneurship development, ensuring that local residents could not only work for renewable energy companies, but also start their own businesses, serving the growing clean energy economy. Dr. James Chen's research and development team had made breakthrough innovations in battery storage technology that were being licensed to manufacturers worldwide. But unlike traditional corporate intellectual property strategies, Phoenix Energy Solutions had structured their licensing agreements to ensure that communities hosting manufacturing facilities received ongoing royalty payments that funded local education and infrastructure improvements. The legal framework they had developed was being studied by community development organizations throughout Latin America and Africa. Small-scale renewable energy projects in Guatemala were using Phoenix Energy Solutions' community ownership models. Village cooperatives in Kenya were adapting their technology licensing approaches. The frameworks that had been designed for American communities were proving relevant to development challenges across diverse global contexts. Victoria's calendar was filled with speaking engagements at universities, where business and engineering students were eager to understand how technical innovation could be aligned with social justice priorities. She had established scholarship programs at her alma mater, Stanford, and her hometown community college in Detroit, ensuring that students from backgrounds similar to her own could access educational opportunities without accumulating crushing debt burdens. The mentorship component had become equally important. Victoria received hundreds of emails each week from young women, particularly women of color, who saw in her success proof that systemic barriers could be overcome through strategic preparation and unwavering commitment to community benefit. She had hired 2 full-time staff members just to coordinate mentorship programs and respond to requests for career guidance. But the most profound impact was happening in communities that most people never read about in business magazines or academic journals. Elementary schools in Phoenix Energy Solutions project areas were incorporating renewable energy education into their science curricula. High school students were designing senior projects around sustainable technology innovations.
Community centers were offering financial literacy workshops that helped families understand how energy efficiency improvements could free up resources for other economic development priorities. The Detroit neighborhood where Victoria had grown up was undergoing its own transformation. The old power plant had been decommissioned, its smokestacks finally silent after decades of polluting the air that children breathed. In its place, a community-owned solar installation was providing clean energy while generating profits that funded scholarships, small business development loans, and healthcare initiatives. Linda Harris had been elected to the Community Development Board overseeing the project, bringing the same attention to detail and fierce advocacy that had carried her daughter through childhood asthma attacks and college applications. The transformation was personal as well as environmental. Families who had been harmed by extractive industries were now benefiting from regenerative alternatives. Victoria's evening routine had changed significantly since the Chicago conference. Instead of working late into the night on financial projections and regulatory filings, she was spending more time reading letters from community partners and reviewing proposals for new collaborative initiatives. Success had brought not just wealth and recognition, but responsibility to ensure that growth served justice rather than simply expanding market dominance. The sunset over the Rocky Mountains reminded her of conversations with Dr. Lue Wei in Shanghai about how renewable energy development could serve communities rather than displacing them. The principles that had guided Phoenix Energy Solutions from its founding remained central to every strategic decision. Environmental sustainability, community ownership, economic democracy, and technical excellence were complementary rather than competing priorities. Her phone displayed a text message from Kevin Johnson, her chief financial officer, confirming that the latest quarterly results had exceeded all projections. But the numbers that mattered most weren't profit margins or stock valuations. They were the thousands of families whose energy costs had decreased, the communities whose economic development had accelerated, and the young people who now saw themselves reflected in positions of leadership and innovation. Victoria walked to her bookshelf and pulled out a worn copy of Katherine Johnson's autobiography, the same book that Mrs. Washington had recommended in that Detroit library 26 years earlier. The inscription on the first page was in her mother's handwriting. Mathematics is the language that describes how the world works. Learn it well, and you can help build a better world.
She had learned it well. More importantly, she had learned that technical expertise without moral clarity was insufficient for meaningful change. The renewable energy revolution wasn't just about replacing fossil fuels with cleaner alternatives. It was about replacing extractive economic relationships with regenerative ones, replacing concentrated power with distributed ownership, replacing environmental destruction with community development. The legacy she was building extended far beyond Phoenix Energy Solutions or even the renewable energy sector. Young women across the country were studying engineering and entrepreneurship with new confidence that their success could serve community needs rather than requiring compromise with exploitative systems. Communities that had been written off by traditional economic development were demonstrating their capacity for innovation and leadership when provided with appropriate resources and respect. Victoria Harris returned to her desk and opened her laptop, where dozens of partnership proposals awaited review. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to prove that environmental justice and economic success could be the same thing. The work was far from finished, but the foundation had been established for transformations that would outlast any individual career or company. Outside her window, the city lights of Denver sparkled like stars, each representing families and communities whose lives had been touched by the proof that systematic change was possible when technical innovation served moral imagination. The future belonged to people who understood that power meant the ability to serve rather than the privilege to dominate. Victoria Harris had not just built a company. She had demonstrated a possibility that would inspire generations of leaders who understood that the greatest innovations combined technological sophistication with unwavering commitment to justice.
The revolution was just beginning.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.